Billy, have you ever had a launch go sideways? Like, people just did not respond to it in the way that you hoped?
That's the way Luke always responds to my cooking. He just throws it sideways against the wall and oh, hang on, did you say lunch or launch?
Yeah, well, today's guest has a doozy of a story. Miguel Fernandez is a VP of design at Slack, and he's looking after the teams that, among other things, did last year's redesign.
Ah, yes, there was definitely a big reaction to that one. But really, Randy, a doozy?
Well, whatever you call it, it was a great chat about product design and how to do lots of things better. So let's get right to it.
Miguel, welcome to the product experience. How are you doing today?
Good. Thank you so much for having me, Randy and Lily. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here to talk with you guys today.
It's really great to have the VP design of Slack. I feel like we've got a proper celebrity in the house because I think everybody uses Slack, right? Who doesn't know who you are? There's probably some people under a rock somewhere who haven't heard about Slack yet, but the
Mhm.
majority of people in my world all use it. So it's such a pleasure to have you on the podcast with us today.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I feel very fortunate to represent a product that like there's only a handful of products in software that people talk about like with their feelings and express things like love for software. So I just feel very privileged to be able to be part of this product.
Oh. So before we get stuck into our topic today, it'd be great if you could give our listeners a quick intro to you and how you got into design.
Oh, I got into science. So I'll try to be brief because I could like go forever on this one. But it started really early in life. I always enjoy like arts, craft, making, right? And I recall like sketching things out. I really love like sketching interfaces. You guys were talking about video, but I was even referring to the fact that I would like go and like draw the car stereos and like stuff like that just to see kind of like the interaction of the buttons. And I love to create things for people. And then of course when I started to get exposed into computers, that opened like a whole new world for me just like when I started to see like graphical interfaces, that was kind of like there's something around here. So the fact that I enjoy doing things with people and then like starting to understand that there was like this big unlock, I started to explore kind of like my professional career. And I was very torn in between like doing something with computers or something around like design. So I ended up like studying computer science and industrial design. But like very easily found out that like my passion was really about like human computer interactions. Like how do you actually like make things for people? How do you help them like interact better with computers and add value that way? So my journey, I think, like for people in my generation was like around like tinkering, right? Like there, like multimedia was coming, the internet was coming, so you're kind of like testing different things. We're building website presentations, CD-ROMs back in the days, animations, right? So I've been privileged to be able to be exposed to kind of like every field of design. I've done like animation, like editing, all those things. And that led me to the path where I'm at today, where I started working in some digital agencies first. And that was a very good moment to like build skills and then move to the product side. I'm from Colombia. I worked initially like in agencies there, but like most of our clients were here in the US. So gave me a lot of exposure to like Fortune 500 clients. And then I moved to the product side and spent most of my career like working on e-commerce. I worked for the two biggest retailers in the world, like Amazon and Walmart, after a couple of acquisitions on the companies that I was in, mostly working on consumer products. Then I moved to San Francisco to work at Airbnb and lead the design team for Airbnb experiences. And that was prior to Slack. So my journey was really more in consumer products. So this is the kind of like first enterprise product that I worked at. And the motivation was precisely that, right? Like really learning about like a different industry and how to build products for the enterprise. So I now have been 4 years in Slack.
So, one of the things we were going to talk about today is what a good relationship looks like between design, engineering, and product. I feel like this is a kind of a massive question. Um, but in your eyes and in your experience, like, what are the things that you look for or try to nurture between those three different functions in order to have a really high performing team?
So I think that the most important thing is that like we need to understand that we cannot build anything without each other, right? Like maybe engineers can't build stuff without us, right? Like and that's a given, right? But it requires like acknowledging like the contribution of each of the functions and kind of like their superpower. And even though like in the process you may wear a little bit of different hats, right? Like while you're like building products, like you have to start with that place that is like respecting each other's craft and understanding like that there's been a lot of experience and thought like in the way that like people work. So I think that that's really important, like leaning into each other's like strengths and understanding that at some moments you're going to challenge them, not because you're challenging the function or the individual, but because like you're really like looking to build the best product that you can. And sometimes it pushes you in that direction. So I think that that's the most important thing to kind of like acknowledge first. And there's like certain dimensions. And the first one is alignment, right? Like if you can really work with people and like talk things through and make sure that you're building alignment up front, like and like understanding like why is it that we're here doing this thing, it helps you like really build trust. And the second one I would think like it's like really like having like clear expectations on how to work, right? Like every function has like different working style. They have kind of like different tensions throughout the product process. So you have to like be upfront and like tell what are your expectations and the way that you like to work so that people can really understand like why sometimes you can be there or cannot be there or work in a certain way. Transparency is crucial, right? Like it's like people won't know what they don't know. And if you cannot kind of like create an environment where people are being very transparent about like how they work, what are they doing, like why are they doing the things in a certain way, people will know. And this is the way that like it helps people to be a little bit more critical and open, right? Like if you're being open, then it's reciprocated with openness. And I think the last two things are kind of like ensuring that you're working as a team. So it's no finger pointing. You cannot be in a team where it's like, oh, product said this, like engineering did that, like design did this. It's more like we're all working together towards the same goal. So how can we support each other? And lastly, like I think that you see high performing teams when there's kind of like a lot of like that, like healthy debates, but like people are having fun. That's when you can like see like the team is in a high performing state.
Fantastic. Miguel, I'm going to ask you something slightly different because it's normally we're talking to product people and they have their view on the world. And I'm curious, you as a design professional, how do you judge designers? When you're hiring people, when you're evaluating their performance, what's the difference between someone who's, not really cutting it, someone who's doing fine, and someone who's an absolute rock star?
Yeah, it's a great question and one that we have to ask ourselves all the time, right? I think like the first thing it's important is to acknowledge that there's different types of designers, right? And like they may excel like in certain dimensions and not on others. So, like we have like storytelling, like people that are great facilitators, people that are really great in interaction design or visual design or coding, right? So you have to really understand the individual, understand their strengths, like help them like build like the skills that they don't have. But that's to say that all not all designers are the same, right? So you have to evaluate it from that angle. Now, but to your question about like what is amazing design, like I think there's like certain traits that like are carried amongst like designers in depending on exactly like where they excel. And one is a little bit of cliche, but it's like falling in love with the problem and not with the solution, right? Like I think that if you see designers that are like too close, like and it happens, right? Like because you're crafting, you're doing something that is like it starts to like feel a little yours. If people can really like detach from what they're doing and understanding that they're doing from for a user, a customer, right? Like that's a good trait to see. Like when you start like seeing people that are like getting too close to their work and defensive about the work, that's something to take note on, right? Another one that I think, and this is the hard one, I think, like with product managers, is balancing kind of like that obsession for craft. Like I think like good designers really like pay attention to the big things and the little things equally, like the strategy to the execution. Because at the end of the day, like we are building products, so we need to like make things happen, right? So good designers can like have that conversation, but like push towards action. Good designers are very humble and self-critical. Like they kind of like are always kind of like, even if they do great work, they feel like they didn't do as well as they could have done, and they challenge their own ideas. And as I said, like they're really like pushing forward, like pushing progress, not just talking about things that making sure that things are happening. And as I said before, I think like one thing that is very important to note is like we wouldn't be able to do this with each other, right? So they have to be great collaborators. Design is a team sport, and you cannot ship just things with design. So that's one of the things I always encourage people when like in cross-functional teams. That is like we have the privilege to be called the designers, but at the end, like everybody contributing in the design process is a designer, and that's like something that like as designers we have to acknowledge and embrace, right?
Yeah, makes perfect sense. Okay, this one I think there's an obvious answer to this, or at least there's the answer that we all believe that there should be, but lots of companies still don't approach things where there's a designer on every team or on every product development team, let's put it that way. So, is that a prerequisite? Should every development team have, or must every team have a designer embedded, or does it work okay sometimes where you have an internal agency model or a designer spread across a couple of teams?
Yeah, that's a great question. One that happens often, and like me even being part of like companies, from like inception to like growth and acquisitions and IPOs and whatnot. I think that that's to be evaluated depending on the moment on where the company and the team is, right? Obviously, like it would be much beneficial to bring a designer as soon as possible, but it has to be understood that there's like certain like cycles in companies where design may not bring as much value as it can, but of course, like my advice would be if you can bring a designer as early as possible, do it. But it's to be understood, right? Like sometimes it's better to have like we have like for instance a product principle that is like prototyping the path. You just need to like have like a prototype to get a feel first to know if the idea is even worth pursuing before like you commit to like making it like feel really good, right? So I think that you have to acknowledge that, and the other thing to be clear is that even in design mature organizations where design like plays an important role, the product development process, there's certain products or certain teams that don't have as much of a need for design, right? And that is okay. Like you have to evaluate it on the business need. How much is really like are you interfacing with the customer? And it could be an internal user too, right? Like you have to be very clear about like, okay, how much do I want to facilitate the experience of this user, even if it's internal, right? Or if there's like certain things that you're like it's not worth investing design because they're not going to like produce the best business outcome. So as a designer, it's like that's a hard question to ask because as I said, like I definitely know the benefits of having design earlier in the process, but you have to understand like the design maturity of our organization like changes over time and as the business evolves. So that's something that like I think it's part of the education in the journey and making sure that people are start seeing the value of design. Obviously, like there's organizations that understand the value of design like really early, so they invest early and they can see the returns very early. But most organizations, you kind of like have to work with them on like building that understanding.
And I guess one of the things that's a bit of a challenge for you guys is you have a lot of people using your product on a daily basis, and not even like on a daily basis, probably on an hourly basis. And so when you want to make quite big changes, and it might be a little bit controversial. And it's funny because Randy reminded me of the big overhaul that you had, was it a year ago, which actually I can't remember what Slack looked like before the change was made. All I remember is that the logo or the logo changed. And I was like, "Oh, I prefer the old logo." So, yeah, how was it kind of being in the business at that time, and how did everyone respond to the feedback that you got during that big change that you introduced?
I think like it's important to acknowledge that like all big changes come with like some suffering, right? Like to your point, like you were talking about like Slack, and this is why I'm like so passionate about Slack, is that this is something that people use multiple hours a day, right? So any like small change that you make can have cascading effects on like people's workflow. So you have to really be empathetic about that. That like if you move like a little button, it's not like other products when people have a need, they go to the product and they are like, okay, they figure it out because they haven't been there in a while. Like in Slack, you're kind of like building muscle memory and you're kind of like in unconscious mode, like going your way around the product, right? So you have to like really be empathetic that that is the case and like that every change that you introduce is going to have like that type of reception, like visceral. Like it's going to be very visceral because like you're talking about like people's work, right? So yeah, we did this change like about like a year ago, and it's primarily motivated because like as you've seen, like Slack was it's kind of like mostly understood as a messaging app, but Slack does much more than that. We knew that like we started to introduce a lot of features, and one of the things that you've probably heard is a lot of people complain about like, hey, Slack is noisy and like I cannot focus, right? So that was kind of like the primary motivation is like how do we build a more focused Slack, understanding that like people struggle a lot with a lot of notifications and alerts through the day, and at the same time acknowledging that like work comes in different ways, not just messaging, right? Like people want to do different things for work, So that's why, like today, as I was talking about, like we have like lists, we have canvases. There's other ways to work at Black. So we had to really like think about kind of like the product life cycle and its maturity, and like we started to like bring up so many like new things into Slack that were challenging kind of like its interaction model that was primarily made for just messaging. So it starts to actually become detrimental to the user experience because you're trying to like fit all these things that don't fit in kind of like just the messaging construct. So you start like to have to think about like, okay, how do we create like better navigational models that will help people focus, which is the primary goal here, and start like helping us like bring all these new capabilities in a way that's still like simple, pleasant, and productive. So that's what we set ourselves to do a while ago. And as I said, like every redesign is challenging because no one was like what we say, like no one's their cheese to be moved, right? So you know that you have to go through this process like being like understanding, being very empathetic, and trust that like if you're doing a good job over time, like you see like people like getting back into the rhythm. So there were like particular things on the design that like people were saying like this is great, and some things that people were like, why are you doing this? I don't understand. That over time, like now people are kind of like, oh, okay, I get it. I know what you're doing. There were some couple of things that even as a robust process that we have in terms of like testing and validating that we're doing the right things and checking with the diversity of our users that we didn't hear loudly enough and only heard until we launched. But the good thing is that we work in pixels. So at the end of the day, like when we realize like that we might have missed something that was very important for customers, we can correct that like hopefully soon. And that's one of the things that I think Slack is really great, that we work really, really fast in like building product.
I'm really curious about that. So when the redesign started rolling out, the biggest frustration that I saw among lots of people across many different groups was I'm representative of a community that is in a lot of different Slack groups. So
Yeah.
losing the switcher between the groups, between the different instances, was a very big deal for a lot of people. So the thing that came out very quickly was, "Oh, there's a shortcut. There's a keyboard shortcut. You can bring it back. You just have to know what it was." And that calmed a lot of people down. But I'm curious, what was it like internally when you rolled this out? Were you expecting this kind of feedback, and how did it feel? How did you respond?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting one. It's actually one that I keep to heart because it's one that we actually, I think we didn't hear as loudly. We did hear some of it, but not as loudly. So, and just to like give you some perspective on our kind of like the way that we test our product is it starts first with a working team, then we start expanding it internally to like a bigger audience of the team, then to the whole company, and then we have like pilot customers that are representative, like that like in some ways like help us like understand like the different archetypes of companies for us to like really gauge like that we are covering all our bases, right? So the workspace one, it's kind of like one that was kind of like a little bit at odds with kind of like the design kind of like intentions because like we're always trying to simplify, right? Like we're trying to simplify. And in this case, we were bringing like one layer of navigation that didn't exist at Slack. So for instance, like we're talking about focus, we bring like a new way to kind of like have all your activity and notifications in one place. And that was something that we didn't have before. So I think that like we were thinking a lot on how to solve the issue of focus and noise for someone that is in a single organization, right? And that's probably like where that design was mostly optimized for. And even internally and like with the organizations we tested, like some people like flagged it. It's like, okay, what happens if you're like in multiple organizations? And in our mind, we were kind of like, okay, you do still have the way to do it, right? Like it may be like buried on one more click, right? But what we quickly realized is that like that's such a very important use case that like it wasn't okay. Like we have one product principle that is called be a good host. And it didn't feel like we were being good host with that user base by tucking that under another click. So at the end we had to work really fast, work on another version that you can now actually like leave the workspaces exposed. And even though like it may look a little noisier because now you have the workspaces and then you have like your workspace navigation, it's one of the designers we have to acknowledge, right? That it's like in this case, the simplest experience for the user is actually having that there than not having it, right? Like so that's the tension. Sometimes as designers we think like, oh, it's simpler to have like less UI. But if you really think about people's workflow, it's like, no, it's actually simpler to have like everything at hand so that I can choose my own path. So yeah, I think like we heard it not as loudly, and as soon as we went to GA with general audience, we heard like very loudly, and like socials and whatnot. And unfortunately, the team had like already spent time thinking about it, right? So it was not like something that caught us like completely out of surprise, but we had like some work done, so it was very relatively easy for us to like get on it and like fix it and launch it.
This episode is brought to you by Pendo, the only all in one product experience platform.
Do you find yourself bouncing around multiple tools to uncover what's happening inside your product?
In one simple platform, Pendo makes it easy to both answer critical questions about how users engage with your product and take action.
First, Pendo is built around product analytics, enabling you to deeply understand user behavior so you can make strategic optimizations.
Next, Pendo lets you deploy in app guides that lead users through the actions that matter most.
Then, Pendo integrates user feedback so you can capture and analyze how people feel and what people want.
And a new thing in Pendo, session replays, a very cool way to experience your users' actual experiences.
There's a good reason over 10,000 companies use it today.
Visit pendo.io/podcast to create your free Pendo account today and try it yourself.
Want to take your product led know how a step further? Check out Pendo and Mind the Product's lineup of free certification courses led by product experts and designed to help you grow and advance in your career.
Learn more today at pendo.io/podcast.
Randy's just reminded me that actually the logo design was about 10 years ago, not last year, which I get these
Yeah.
things conflated in my brain. But anyway, I mean, it sounds like it was kind of quite a huge sort of process for you, and that you do have like a really thorough regime for testing and everything. But is there anything that you've changed, like since that experience, that you've changed in order to try and avoid as much sort of fallout, I guess, from a change like that? And I suppose actually,
Yeah.
now that you've made that change, you probably won't do such a big change again anytime soon. But yeah, is there anything that you've changed in your processes from that?
Well, I think like the first thing is that in retrospect, you would wanna have like done things like different, right? Like every time that you can like look in retrospect, it's easier to do things to think about how to do things different at the moment. So there was definitely like a learning experience there that is like we did hear the feedback like so we probably like didn't think it was as loud, but maybe it was as loud as it was before going to GA. But to your point about like doing changes like this type of changes like don't come often. Like this big redesigns like don't come often. You hopefully like don't need them. They only come like if the product is building way too much design debt that like the team has to be like, okay, we have to like fix like this core things on the product. Or if you are going through a process of maturity as we were going, that is like we're actually introducing a lot more functionality. So we need to like be ready for that. So we did that then to, as I say, like address both like focus and knowing that we had like some things down the line that were coming, but like we there's no need to like redesign the product. Like this is not like a thing that you do because it's like, oh, redesigning it's fun. It's more about like what is really the business and the user need here. And back in the days was preparing the land for like things like what we have today. We've launched things like canvases, like lists, and a couple more things to come, like all our AI efforts. And without doing like without preparing the product to support all those features, you would probably have like a lot more complaints of it than with the redesign.
Miguel, I work with a lot of places that are either providing utility type products or B2B SaaS type things. They're things that people use for a purpose. They don't want to spend, the users themselves don't want to spend that much time on the platform. They want to get something done. And you've
Yeah.
done a lot of that in your career, but now you're working on something, as you said, people spend hours a day on this. They spend it in a work context and in a personal context. What's the difference in your approach? What kind of principles are different when you're catering to people spending a lot of their time on a platform rather than just as a means to an end?
Well, I think like even the journey of what we're talking about, like the workspace switcher, is like I remember even when I was coming to Slack, like coming from products that came more from like I have a need, so I'll go to this place to like fulfill my need to like I'm in this place because I'm doing work. I have now a lot more empathy on like what how to bring these types of changes, right? You were asking about like a redesign, like so I've learned at Slack how thoughtful you have to be in moving a button, right? Like in other products, you A/B test and you do a bunch of like things to like move like buttons, but in here, like it's that you have to be a little bit more mindful. So I think on a personal level, that has been actually my biggest like, learning, because I came really hot to like try to like quote unquote improve some of the things, and then I realized really fast that it's like to your point, like it's like no, people don't want these things to move because this is part of the workflow. So that's on a personal level. Like on a company level, we have a set of principles that really like help us guide decision making cross functionally, mostly on the product team, but also like help us make decisions as a company. And like some of them, like and they kind of like allude to what you were talking about, and like maybe not changing things. It's like one of them, it's like don't make me think. It's like we don't want like people to stop in the user interface to think about what is it that they need to do to accomplish their goal. So that's a principle that we use. The other one that I mentioned before is being a great host. We want to make sure that like we're acknowledging, understanding like what is it that you're trying to accomplish, and doing the best to be a good host. Another one is like don't reinvent the wheel, right? It's like there's things that don't need to be reinvented. There's already mental models built for certain things. So we try to capitalize and leverage that as much as possible. And then the other ones that are a little bit more about the way that we work are really around like prototyping the path. That is like, let's try these things like really fast and get a feel. And in some cases, it's like, okay, let's do like bigger bets, like what we did with that redesign, where you have to like know what you're doing and make the bet and know that it's going to pan out later down the road.
How did you come up with your principles? Are they things that you just carry with you in the businesses that you've worked with, or are these kind of specific to Slack and the team that you work with now?
Yeah, these ones are specific to Slack, and as most things that we do, they're living principles, right? Like, and they need to be checked once in a while. I think we've revisited since I've been here at Slack. The past 4 years, we've revisited one of them. I don't remember what it was before, by the way, but we've revisited them once. So they're living, and they obviously depend on the organization and like what an organization values, right? So fortunately, like in all the companies that I worked at, like we've had like very clear like values and principles, right? Amazon, for instance, has like the tenets, like they have like some tenets. Like when I worked at Jet, we have the same, and Airbnb the same. So obviously, like they all depend on the organization around the values of the company. But for Slack, these are actually like they've been really fascinating to be part of this at Slack, because I do believe that, for instance, the fact that we prototype the path, it's like embedded in our culture. Like the fact that people move really fast and are very open to try something and like acknowledge that it was not good and then like move on. It's a really good practice. So yeah, this I wish this would be like my personal one, but these were actually like here at Slack when I got here.
Lots of companies have principles like this that, best idea wins and things like that. It's harder for them to actually embody them and make it part of the culture. What's the secret to doing that well?
What is the secret to doing product principles well? I think that like well representing like the company values, right? And because at that point, like it's up on the individuals to acknowledge if they kind of like identify with the company values, right? But I think that if they really start like from the company values, and if you treat them also like a product in the way that like you're bringing people along in the process, right? Like this product principles are part not just of like somebody came up with them, but it was like really like a process of like good collaboration, good feedback loops, right? Like trying to like say like, okay, if we care about these things and building the best product for our users, like how is it that we're going to like accomplish that? So as I said, like we did like one revision of these, and it was a process where like it's open to the company to give feedback to make sure that they're like being represented in the process. So I would say that that's something that I would definitely suggest, that you kind of like bring people along and like make sure that you're hearing from across the company.
How do they get referred to on a sort of daily basis? Like, do you hear conversations where people are like, "Oh no, hang on, don't make me think." So, or like, "Don't make the customer think." So let's just, do this
Yeah.
differently or change this, or like how does it sort of come to life in your work?
Yeah, no, it's literally like that. And by the way, like in Slack, we have like reactees, right? And we have like a reactee for each of these. And sometimes when people are kind of like providing an argument, like people react with that like reactee around the principle, so that you can map it back to that. Also, when we do our design crits, when we're talking about the design crits, we actually try to like use them and like or use them as a framing to ask some of the questions, right? And it's like, hey, do you think that you been like the greatest host that you can be like designing this, right? Or like sometimes when teams are kind of like going through like a more philosophical kind of like debate. Like, what if we do this or that or this or that? And you can see like the team kind of like starting to go in a rabbit hole. You're like, hey, wait a second. You can probably like prototype the path in this one because it's like, I think, for instance, like people's misunderstandings, like, oh, prototype to get the answer. We use this principle of prototyping the path to help us like answer questions, right? It's like, okay, we don't know the answer to this question. Let's prototype this thing to get to the next hill. So yeah, like we see them in practice all the time as we're building products, as we're doing design crits, as we're evaluating, like even with our executives, they're like, hey, don't reinvent the wheel here.
Okay, you just brought up design crits a couple of times, which is a topic that I really love because I think it's something that, designers go to school and they learn how to do crits properly. But product people, we don't do them nearly as often. And I've long thought it would be a good practice to bring into product management tribes and teams. What's the secret to doing a good crit? Have you ever done this on more of a product side than just a pure design side?
Yeah, well, this is a great question. Actually, like part of like how we collaborate here at Slack, one of the things that we've done is actually like leverage Slack a lot to for this type of process, right? So we use huddles, and it's a great way to do crits because everybody can like kind of share the word. You see them in video, but we have kind of like the thread going on. And as I was saying, like we kind of like have like some emojis and reactions to kind of like classify the type of feedback where you're saying like, hey, this is visual design feedback, like product feedback, UX feedback. And one of the things that, as I was saying, like what is important to like build like good cross collaboration is transparency. So first, like we've invited like product folks, engineer folks into a design crit, right? Like I think like some organizations kind of like say like, hey, I'm gonna talk with designers, and you guys are not like allowed. It's like no, this is open. Like you also have like some perspective to share here, and it's important to hear that perspective to be able to think about the problem, right? Obviously, like I work and we work a lot with like product managers and engineers to be, hey, it's a forum that it's meant to like be thought provoking, challenging. So don't come here like kind of like to say like, hey, you're blowing up my scope. Like if you do this, like I will have to move timers. It's like really be open to like have this forum to debate ideas, and then we'll get into the scoping conversation. But this is really like to poke on the idea. So one thing that we do is like we use huddles. We invite like cross-functional folks. Well, there's ways to like classify the feedback, right? So that people can contribute. And the cool thing is that even if you cannot attend, like let's say you're a product manager, you cannot attend to the crit, you can always go back to the thread and like get a sum, like literally go through the thread or get an eye summary of the thread so that you are up to speed on the conversation. So it's part of the practice of like building like good cross-functional relationships, building transparency. And I do think that we definitely love like having cross-functional folks because sometimes, as I said, like designers can also like go into this like more philosophical quest. And that's where I said like it's important to leverage each other's strengths. And like product managers can be really good at saying like, hey, love that quest, pursue that quest, but like let's make sure that we continue on this path, right? So that's been really, really helpful too for us when we do these scripts.
Just coming back around to the question that we asked right at the top of the conversation, where we talked about sort of like, what good designers look like, or kind of how you judge a good designer, and something that you said as well around like early on in your career, you did quite a lot of different things, animation and working in agencies and exploring different things. And when I think back to what designers had to do, like when I first started working in tech companies, you had your designer and then you had your UX person as well. And they were two different disciplines. I think maybe they still are in
Mhm.
some organizations, but generally you get product designers these days who sort of cover everything. But is there something that designers should be sort of like trying to aim for, like a level of understanding of, interactions, animations, information architecture? Like, I feel like there's so much that you need to know in order to really be able to do an amazing design job. It just
Yeah.
feels like a lot for designers. I mean, maybe they have a little bit more help these days, like the tools are a bit better, but what's your sort of
Yeah.
tip for if there are designers listening, or maybe even just for the product people listening, like feel a little bit sorry for everything that the designer has to think about?
Yeah. Well, I think you're right. Like the world has changed. And I remember even when I started to think about like this profession, like it was not even called product design, right? Like you have like, it was very clear and it was very waterfally. You do the requirements, you do this, you do that, right? Like, and that was kind of like the process. but we've changed things and in a better way, right? And that's why I was saying like everybody's a designer in a way. Like it's much better to have a conversation with a product manager engineer early on than like until something is built and you're like, oh, this is actually wrong, right? We made like some wrong assumptions here. So in terms of like the skill set, I do think that these days there's like more companies and more expectations that designer must do everything, but like you also have to be realistic that that is not the case for most people, right? Like it is important to kind of like be well rounded and understand like all the facets of design, like what it takes into building like a good product. And these days, like it's definitely you have to know a little bit of like motion, a little bit of coding if possible. You have to become like the best coder. Maybe not to your point. There's like now tools for that. But when you're thinking about your design team, that's one of the things that you have to consider that you can probably like find a couple of like folks that are going to be like that, but then you also have to like have like some specialists, right, that are going to just like own their craft, let's say like visual design, some in typography, right? So even though they are going to be like focused on that, doesn't mean that they not shouldn't be versed on the other facets of design. But as a leader and like part of the organization and working with your product partners is understanding also like who is in the right role, right? Like you cannot put like that type of designer into this type of problem. You also have to like make sure that you're like placing the person with the right skill set into the right problem. But I just think that the advice is I would say that like yeah, it's like keep curiosity. Like people need to continue to be curious and learn everything that is out there. Because like the more that you know, it's like the more conversations you can have, right? Like if you can really like go to an engineer and have a dialogue, maybe you're not an engineer or like code as much, but you can understand like how things are built. You have like a higher likelihood of affecting that product if you do so.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And one of the other things that I think is really different now is the expectations of the consumer in terms of design. Like we have so many really easy to use, beautiful looking products that we use on a daily basis. And I think there's like such a high expectation from a consumer of like, you know, if something doesn't feel right or flow right, it's so much more noticeable now than back in the old days when it was just like, you know, as long as it did the job that you needed it to do, then I mean, what was it? If you a hair on fire problem, it can be like a really rubbish solution and you can get away with it because it's just such an important problem to solve. Whereas I think the expectation of consumer from a design point of view is just like the standards are much higher across the board.
Yeah, absolutely. That's absolutely that has changed. And if you think about like OSs, like have evolved, like now you have a phone in your hand that has like all these like beautiful interactions, right? Like you didn't used to have that before. Just imagine like texting back in the days. You had to like press the key like 7 times to get like the one letter and then the next one. Now you have like a full keyboard there. So definitely the expectations have changed. And that's what has made it actually like pretty interesting, right? Like at Airbnb and like here at Slack too, like we had such like the design team is so diverse in terms of skills. Like you wouldn't imagine sometimes like why would you need like a filmographer like in a design product design team? And you're like, okay, actually, because they have like this ability to understand certain things that if you translate that into the product experience, you're actually making a much better experience. So as you're also building a design team, it's like we were talking before, like, okay, when do you bring a designer? Do all teams need designers? But if you can, actually, it's really good to start like bringing a different mix of designers. Like it's like we have like people that are dedicated to motion, right? And part of the things that we do in my team that is in charge, kind of like design systems too, is kind of like look at the interface and say like, can we actually make it a little bit delightful? Can we actually like make it smooth in the experience, right? And those are little things that sometimes like companies are not willing to invest, but because the standards are much higher now you have to be like playing in that game. Like Slack has been differentiating here, simple, pleasant, and productive, right? Like the word pleasant is important here because we've been always very thoughtful and deliberate about that. But other companies are kind of like saying like, oh, why Slack? Oh, because they care about crowd, they care about this. So it's definitely like something that now is as you were saying, it's more expected than before.
You know, my son is 12 years old now, and his school won't let them have smartphones, so he's got an old Nokia, and he's experiencing the pain of texting. He hates it. It's hilarious. Um, anyway, you just again you brought up crits and delightful, so I need to ask a question. In terms of the perspective of you, coming from the design side, what do you see that product people are not doing right? What could we do to make the life of designers, the life of product development teams better? What are we missing sometimes?
I love that question, and it's one that I always talk with like product design leaders, and it's I mean we were talking about like a little bit about like expectations, right? Like I think that sometimes product managers like want things in a certain way, right? Like it's like kind of like they may see like a through line to the end result of something, so they kind of like come hot to a designer and say like, hey, just do this, right? And they're less open to have a dialogue, and but if you kind of like break that down and understand the why, it's because like I personally feel that the hardest role in a product team is the one of the product manager, because you have to be like managing expectations from the executives, like managing expectations from your customer, right? So you have to balance a bunch of like different things from teams that may not even report directly to you. So the most important thing is like, okay, how do you establish a relationship where you maximize like the designer contribution, right? Like how do you help the designer like have some room, some leeway to actually like propose, right? And this is a hard thing to balance, obviously, because everybody is up to a timeline. You need to like deliver. But I think the most important thing is like creating that space, right? Like creating that space. And almost like if you're thinking about like your product portfolio, you have to kind of like think about like different bets, ones that are high, like low effort, high return. But there's like certain things that are like more like design investigations or problems that are worth like doing some exploration. And what I found is that designers, like if they are in a team where actually like enables a lot of that, where they can like really like show like, hey, you're giving me like a problem space, right? And here's like how to think about it and really work in collaboration. They tend to perform much better than if it's like you're giving me the solution and you just want me to like make it pretty, right? Because it's that's a hard spot to be in for any designer. And and in a way, like even when we're talking about skills, like I also like tell designers like you can think about their tensions and their motivations, right? Like on your partners, but also we have the superpower of helping like communicate ideas. So this is the other flip side is sometimes designers are like, oh, like the product or the engineer did a sketch, like why? And it's like they're just trying to like have a conversation. So use that as a way to have that dialogue. Actually, like give them tools to do so, right? Like the more that you understand, the better that you can work together, right? So that's on the designer side. But as I said, like on the product side, I would definitely like encourage more like room for people to be able to bring their craft, right? Their special power into the conversation.
Miguel, thank you so much for joining us. We have now run out of time, but it's flown by and I've really, really enjoyed hearing everything that you've had to say. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing all of your advice and insight with us.
Thank you, Lily. Thank you so much, Randy.
This was a great chat.
The Product Experience hosts are me, Lily Smith, host by night and Chief Product Officer by day.
And me, Randy Silver, also host by night. And I spend my days working with product and leadership teams, helping their teams to do amazing work.
Luron Pratt is our producer and Luke Smith is our editor.
And our theme music is from product community legend Arnie Kittler's band, POW. Thanks to them for letting us use their track.